First, let's look at the number one major misconception, lie, or, well, I guess I would say the biggest misconception or lie that pervades the black community, and that is our relationship with the Democratic Party. Here is the misconception and the outright lie of that relationship. We are told by those that are leaders in the black community that of the two political parties, Republican and Democrat, that the Republican Party is racist, while the Democratic Party is the friend of the black community. Black leaders will say, though the Democratic Party is not perfect for us, we definitely need to stay away from the Republican Party because it is against the black community. This, my friends, is the biggest misconception and outright lie that if you consider the absolute truth, remember what I said the definition of truth is, you would run from the Democratic Party like you would run from a plague. If you go back, I hear so many times people say, if you don't know where you come from, or you don't know the history or something like that, or if you don't know your history or so forth, you won't know where you're going, and you are bound to repeat the exact same problem that you have created in the past. So it is important for us to know our history and know the past. Yet and still, when it comes down to the two parties, history shows us, and I think I alluded to it a little earlier, that the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, segregation, and essentially keeping blacks under its feet. They don't want blacks to be able to succeed in anything that would make them equal to, or God forbid to them, better than white people. I'm talking about the Democratic Party. That is the core belief of this party. Now, right there, a lot of you saying, I don't believe it, I don't want to hear anymore. Guess what? That is you refusing to look at truth. You'll accept a half a truth. Oh well, they do some good things for us. They uh, make sure that we have enough food to eat. They start programs like food stamps, and they provide health care for us and things like that, so we can go to the doctor and so forth. True, they are, but all of that is part and parcel of keeping you as a slave. The slave in the past was dependent on his or her master. They looked to the master to feed them, to provide some sort of shelter for them, and to provide protection of their lives, because if they went off of the plantation for some reason, if the master did not give them uh, a slip of paper or some sort of mark identifying them as the property of this particular party, this particular master, and that they were uh, part of a certain plantation and that they had permission to be off of the plantation, that slave could be lynched or captured and taken to market and sold to another master. That dependency on the master back in the times of slavery is the same type of dependency that the black community has for the Democratic Party today. In fact, if you look at it, when it comes down to Democrat versus Republican, whenever a Republican seems to be getting ready to defeat a Democrat in an election, what are some of the first things that the Democrat will pull out of their bag if they haven't done it already? And that is, if you vote for my opponent, he's going to take away your food stamps. He's going to take away your shelter, your house, put you out on the streets. If you take away, if you vote for my opponent, the Republican, you aren't going to be able to pay for your health care. You're going to starve, you're going to die, and all that other stuff. That is the core that the Democrats use to keep the black community. And even though this is not only to the black community, you see, because right now the Democratic Party is in the process of making everybody slaves, because the more people that they have that are dependent on their party for shelter and food and so forth, you have become a slave to this party. And you can't deal with that. You don't want to accept the fact that you are a slave. The word slave is something that people do not want to hear when it comes down to their relationship to the Democratic Party. Now, they'll use slave when they go talk about the Republican Party trying to uh, take this country back to slavery times and all this other stuff. Well, see, that is the impression that the black community gets because of the half truths and outright lies that the institutions like the public school systems in this nation, especially in the areas of, in urban areas or black community areas, in those school systems, the history that is being taught is a history of half truths and outright lies. And because over 50 years, blacks have been inundated with this half truth about our relationship with the Democratic Party and Republican Party. Over 50 years, actually, I would dare say uh, closer to 60, because in 19, I'll tell you where our major problem uh, comes up. It comes up when in 1952 the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown versus the Board of Education suit that was essentially sponsored by the NAACP. The courts ruled that the idea of separate but equal education was not beneficial to blacks, and that blacks should be allowed into the previously all white public school system. Here is the problem. This lawsuit, Brown versus the Board of Education, was basically started in what were known as the slave states, Alabama, Mississippi, and the like. Okay? Now, here is the truth of the matter, and I'll have to give you the whole background so you can understand just exactly how we wound up being dependent on a party that basically has always held the notion that blacks are inferior to whites, that segregation is the way to keep the white race pure and above the black race, keeping us underfoot, so to speak. We have to go back and look at history, and from that point you will begin to see why we're in the condition we're in now, to a party that essentially has us enslaved. It in the school systems, the white school systems in the slave states, the slave owner descendants and so forth, and the kids that were being brought up in these slave states were being brought up and taught a history that essentially said that the Republican Party is the enemy of the principles that these slave states in the Democratic Party held, as far as it comes down to segregation and slavery and so forth, and relationship with blacks. They tell their children that the reason why uh, mom and dad and grandparents who at one time owned large plantations, had all types of owned all types of slaves. After all, mind you, now this was a major business in these slave states, and people and slave owners, people that owned plantations and things, they were filthy rich. I mean, they were able to travel where they wanted to travel, all over the world, do everything they wanted to do. Why? Because they had all this money and things, and they were going to uh, perpetuate it by passing it down from generation to generation to generation. And kids would inherit the wealth of the parents. But after the Civil War, when the South was defeated, they still did not want to let go of their slaves, and they began to form political parties and so forth, out of which the Democratic Party was essentially formed to continue to promote this type of slave owner mentality. So when the South, the teachings of the white schools in the slave states was one of, the Republicans are the enemy and we have to defeat the Republicans so we can essentially get back to some sort of state where we can continue to keep blacks in their place. The last thing they wanted to see was any successful black individual, man, male or female. So they began to essentially instill in their kids history that said basically that even though the South lost the Civil War, that essentially it wasn't right, that it was basically ungodly, because they tended to believe that the Bible supported the fact of them owning slaves. It was Christian, so to speak, the Christian thing to do. So in other words, these racists painted themselves as being victims of an evil Republican Party. That's it in a nutshell. And so that became part of the history that they taught every child that was going to the public school system in these slave states. That's part of the history that's instilled in those school systems. Well, when Brown versus the Board of Education became law and blacks had the opportunity to attend these school systems, guess what? Blacks began to be taught this same history, that the Democratic Party were the victims of the evil Republican Party. And consequently, blacks picked up on that. Because, see, here's one of the other things you have to look at. And see, this is part of experience, and this is where the truth really got bent out of shape. I mean, got bent and twisted. When these slave owners lost in their battle to own slaves, and they had to essentially set the slaves free, several things happened. The worst thing that happened is that the slave owner uh, killed off as many of the slaves as they could through lynching or shooting them or whatever. Other slave owners threw the slaves off of the plantation. Well, when you put the slaves off of the plantation where everything that they owned or had for, like the shelter, the clothing, and so forth that they had, and the food, now that you've thrown them off of the plantation, you are essentially sending them out to try to fend for themselves. Now, what this did is this brought into existence another solution to the slave being thrown off of the plantation, and that is some slave owners that had some sort of looking at the slaves and had some sort of compassion for them, said, well, look, I don't own you anymore, but I'll give you a piece of land, of my land. You can stay on the land and work the land and keep the what you produce and things for yourselves, or a portion of a thing for yourselves, and I'll take the rest. But it's no longer a master-slave relationship per se. It is now a relationship where everybody benefits from the production of the slaves, whereas before it was only the master that benefited the slaves. Essentially had to depend on the master to give them a portion, but now under this sharecropping type thing, the dynamics changed. But anyway, the slave owners in the Democratic Party began to tell, like I say, the blacks got into the slave public school system of the South in the slave states, and they were taught that the Republicans were the enemy, that the Republicans are the reason why their grandmothers and great grandmothers and descendants were poor is because of the evil Republican Party. And as a result of that, like I said, a lot of this stuff started back in the 50s, around 54 or so, after, when the thing got implemented. What happened is, well, you figure from 54, and at the time this is being recorded, it's 2012. That's 58 years. Imagine how many blacks have gone through the school systems in the slave states in the South and have picked up the idea that the Republicans are the racists and the Democrats are the ones that are actually the compassionate ones to the black community. History got twisted around because we forced our way into a system that was going to essentially corrupt us and our history and give us the wrong sense of history versus the truth of history. As a result, we've linked ourselves. I mean, these former students of the schools of the South got indoctrinated with this. They indoctrinated their children with it. They wrote books about it. The Republicans are the enemy. The Republicans this, the Republicans that. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, remember they were in the slave states. But there was a problem. There weren't many good jobs for blacks down in the slave states. All of the industrial, all of the good jobs and the well paying jobs were, guess where? Up north. Detroit, Michigan, and so forth. So, guess what happened? They packed up their bags and came north. When they got here, the school systems needed teachers and things. Well, those that were educated in the southern schools and so forth, blacks, come up here applying for jobs as teachers and things, and they began to, like I say, the population, a lot of these these former blacks from the slave states come up to the northern states where blacks could get jobs and things. There was not that much. There might have been some discrimination, but it wasn't that much. And the problem became evident that they brought their misguided view of history up north with them, and that competed with history according to what was being taught up here in the north. And as more blacks came up here from the former slave states with this corrupt vision of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, as more blacks came up here, school system began to slowly change the view of history, or basically what it is. You could have blacks in the school, but at the time, blacks were complaining that the only thing that was being taught in the schools up in the north was white history. But now, mind you, the white history they're referring to is history that was the truth of the slave era, about who was the friend of the slaves versus who were the actual enemies of the slaves and the black community. Blacks were saying that the schools were essentially teaching things that were not true black history, and there were protests and things about that. So finally, the school systems began to adopt history according to what was being taught down in the slave states to make the blacks feel comfortable, because to them the history that they gained through the integration, the desegregation of the school systems in the slave states, was now the being taught in the schools up in the north. Well, naturally, the response to a lot of the school systems in the cities up in the north, like in Detroit and so forth, is it brought about a situation where those that were being taught the truth of history were not going to allow their kids to be taught a corrupt view of history, and therefore they which at the time were mostly whites, started their own independent school systems and private school systems to teach history the way the truth actually is, and left these the blacks that wanted to have the history of that they learned from down south in the schools down in the south to be prevalent in the community. That's how we got into the position now where, despite the fact that it was Republicans and people from the North that went down in the South, battled in the Civil War and so forth to set the slaves free. Abraham Lincoln signed the proclamation of setting the slaves free, and everything the Republican Party and the like had been doing over the uh, decades since the Civil War was all to set blacks free. But here, after Brown versus the Board of Education and the move of former slaves from these former slave states to the north and infiltrated the school systems in the north and things and so forth like that, all of this stuff brought about the idea that the Democrats are the good people and the Republicans are the evil people, and that the Republicans are the racists. But once again, that's all because of half truths and basically flat out lies. I couldn't even say that that's 99% truth, because quite frankly there is no truth in that at all, period. But like they tell you long have said in the past, you keep telling a lie long enough, and then all of a sudden, you look around one day and it's seen as the truth. Well, that truth does not jive with the actual truth of what happened. And see, all of this stuff is in history books. But when people try to bring this fact up, just like I'm bringing it up, if you've listened to this presentation this long, I would take my hat off to you, because a lot of people, once they see where somebody's going, they shut it off right away because they don't want to hear it. And that's the main reason why we are in the condition that we are in this nation as far as the black community is concerned, because every bit of legislation that Democrats pass that looks like it's going to benefit the black community, the only thing it is being passed for is to essentially keep the black community on the plantation. And that gives them, the Democrats, the power to be able to get reelected when it comes time for, the elections and things. Blacks come out in massive numbers supporting the good Democratic Party over the evil Republican Party. And the end result is the Democrats get elected. They go in and pass more legislation that they say is going to benefit the black community. But the underlying truth of the matter is everything that they are doing in this legislation, it looks like it's going to do good, but down the road, 3, 4, 5, 10 years or so down the road, it's going to enslave more and more of our people. And as a result, the end result is that more people are going to be dependent on the Democratic Party or dependent on government, with the Democratic Party being in charge, so that they can have more power to continue to do the things that they want to do, and that is basically enslave every citizen of the United States. I don't think I'm going to go any further than this, but I will say this. If we look at another country that essentially followed in other words, well, let me put it this way. The other country didn't follow us. We followed them in their policies and things, where they got control over the people. And I'm talking about Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. Every bit of legislation or everything that the Adolf Hitler instituted under Nazi Germany, because people wonder how in the world did Hitler, a man that nobody uh, knew that much about, how did he rise up in the ranks to become the Fuhrer, and how was he able to do a lot of the things he did? He was able to do it by force per se, but the bottom line is this: he destroyed all private businesses. Anything that competed against government, he destroyed it. Well, when he destroyed the private businesses and so forth like that, where people were able to make their own money and live their lives, in freedom, they became dependent then on the government. And therefore, the only way that they could get benefits from the government is they essentially had to fall in line with what the government was trying to do, which at the time was take over all of Europe and then spread throughout the world. So that's how people back then, we always wonder how in the world how the German citizens managed to stand for something like that, because of the way they went about doing it. Well, if we look at what the Democratic Party is doing, it's on a scale along the same line of destroying private businesses and making the people dependent on government. And as people become dependent on government, then they look at any group, or in this case the Republican Party, that's trying to break the mold of making people dependent on government. And the first thing we have leaders in our community today that is calling what the Republican Party is trying to do as being evil. See, we got all of this mess going on, so black folks continually cling to the Democratic Party and call Republicans evil. So, hence, we are repeating the exact same things that history has shown us don't work. Like over Nazi Germany, and even today, if we look at nations over in Europe and so forth that are going bankrupt and all this other stuff for providing health care and so forth, and taking care of their citizens from the time they're born till the time they die. We see that happening over there, but yet over here we tend to think that can't happen to us. Think again. Well, that's all I want to say about it. There's a lot more that I can say about this, and I probably will, but in different subjects on different times and so forth. But essentially, that is the bottom line, because we aren't dealing with truth. We're dealing with partial truth, a misconception of truth, and outright lies. And for some, It's just we don't know, and we just go along with those that we trust, which is our leaders, and they are essentially leading us because they don't know their own selves. Or, like I said, it's either 99% truth, 75% truth, half truth, quarter% truth, or outright lie. And we trust them, and that's what they're feeding us with. So we stay in the position that we are in. I hope you got something out of this lengthy presentation. But now you see where our problems in the black community lie. But remember this, the words of Jesus. He said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." But if you don't want to believe in Jesus, remember what the old folks say. Castor oil. It may not taste good, but it will surely cure what ails you. This evangelist George McTyre saying, good day, and may God bless you and your families real good.